I'm going to use this video to talk about the relationship between media coverage and public attitudes during election campaigns and at other times as well. I think it's relatively common for those of us who study media to think about media as affecting public attitudes. In the context of an election, for instance, we expect that media will report information and that the public will respond to that information. Let's imagine what that might look like over time. Imagine that you have a trend, and that trend is in the tone of media coverage of a political candidate, and that tone becomes more positive and more negative over time based on campaign events. Our expectation, generally speaking, is that public attitudes about that candidate, let's say approval of that candidate, might vary systematically following media coverage. Media coverage gets more positive, and public attitudes towards that candidate become more positive as a consequence. Media coverage gets more negative, public attitudes about that candidate become more negative as a consequence. And so we would see over time shifts in media coverage that tend to be followed by corresponding shifts in public attitudes. There is another possibility, perhaps less considered in academic research, but I believe equally probable. And that is that media does not lead public opinion, but follows public opinion. Consider the following possibility. In the context of an election campaign, journalists are out there experiencing the campaign, going to rallies, seeing how people respond, and reporting how those people are responding. Media companies are also commissioning polls. They're getting polling data and reporting on that polling data. That's not about media leading opinion so much as media following opinion. And so one of, I think, the most interesting questions for researchers who are interested in the relationship between media and public opinion in the context of an election campaign is, do media lead or follow public opinion? This question was the focus of work that Christopher Wlezien and I did on the 2016 presidential election campaign in the US. To do that work, we gathered public opinion data over the course of the year leading up to the election, and we content analyzed media coverage over the course of that same time period. For media coverage, we're downloading news stories about the election from major newspapers across the US and using automated techniques to extract the tone of coverage of the two candidates, comparing the tone of coverage of Clinton to the tone of coverage of Trump, and relating that kind of net difference in coverage to differences in support for the two candidates over that time period. What we find is that there's evidence that media leads public opinion before Labor Day. That is, in the early stages of the election, we see evidence that media leads public opinion. But in 2016, after Labor Day, in those 2 months just prior to the election, we no longer find strong evidence that media are leading opinion. Indeed, if anything, it looks during that time period like opinion is leading media. It thus appears that media sometimes lead opinion, and opinion sometimes leads media. That can happen in the context of a single election campaign. Now, this is not to say that media are always doing some combination of affecting and reflecting public attitudes. There will be some domains in which the public has relatively little experience or knowledge, and the media will be leading more than following. And there will be other domains, let's say in the context of a national election, where media are doing some combination of responding to the public and feeding that public the information they need in order to adjust their preferences. Recognizing that this is the case should change our interpretation of what we see in media content. As scholars of political communication, when we look at media content, particularly in the context of election campaigns, we might think more seriously about whether this content is the material that is driving public attitudes or whether this content is reflecting those attitudes. Put differently, we might think of that content less as a kind of exogenous influence on public opinion and more as a reflection of the nature of public debate at the time. And how might this recognition that media both lead and follow in the context of election campaigns change our understanding of the role of media in recent elections? Let's take as an example the 2016 campaign. I'm going to draw now on work that I and co-authors have done in a forthcoming book focused on the content of news and recalled news in the 2016 campaign. In the 2016 campaign, Gallup asked 500 people every night whether they had read, seen, or heard anything about both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And if people said yes, Gallup asked them what, and then recorded their response. This is a relatively unique body of data. Never before have we had, with that kind of volume, 500 people every night over the course of the campaign. Never before have we had that kind of volume of verbatim responses, of recalled news coverage. And that body of data allows us to explore the relationship between news coverage and what people recall from that news coverage. One of our findings is that not everything that gets reported in news finds its way into public opinion. That I think is probably pretty obvious. But one of the findings in the 2016 campaign is that there were a few storylines that really stuck in the public mind and other storylines that simply did not. So for instance, the Hillary Clinton campaign spent most of the election campaign period trying to reduce the impact of stories about email. Email was systematically the most mentioned word when people were asked what they had read, seen, or heard about Hillary Clinton. And that was true even on days when media themselves were not necessarily emphasizing the email story. So let's take a look at some data from the 2016 campaign. What we're going to do is take the Gallup open-ended responses from each week of the campaign from July onwards. And we'll take all the words that people said about the news that they recalled having read, seen, or heard about Hillary Clinton in the campaign. We're going to aggregate that weekly, and then we're going to look at the top 5 words recalled every week of the campaign. And what we're going to do is show those 5 words, and we're going to have the size of the word reflect how frequent that word was. So it's the top 5 words in descending order. The largest word is the word that was most mentioned. And if we do that every week of the campaign, what we see is in almost every single one of those weeks, email is the most recalled word. And there really are only 2 exceptions. One is when there is a debate in a week, and another is when there are concerns about Hillary Clinton's health. I believe these results are interesting in several different ways. One of the ways in which I've been thinking about them is that by remembering that what we retain from media coverage doesn't perfectly match what that media coverage is, remembering that helps account for how there can be movement in public opinion that is independent of media coverage. Public opinion is not going to move always in parallel with media coverage, partly because we don't retain all of that coverage, and also because we have our own experiences, our own discussions with family members and with friends. We get information from outside media as well. So the things that we recall having read, seen, or heard about Hillary Clinton are not going to perfectly match media coverage. And that's going to mean that there is movement in public opinion that is separate from media coverage, movement that may then be noted by journalists and reported on. This creates this kind of reciprocal link over time between media coverage and public attitudes over the course of an election campaign. In sum, the findings that we get with the Gallup data are, for me, a nice reminder of the findings in the first paper I was talking about. Namely, findings that make clear that even in the course of a single election campaign, there can be periods where media is both leading and following. This, for me, is the lesson of all of these results in 2016, a lesson that I think is probably generalizable beyond the US election in 2016. That lesson is that media do not just lead public opinion. There are times when media leads and times that media follows. Recognizing that is really critical for future work that seeks to understand the role that media plays in election campaigns.